Hi, I'm Edward Unthank. I'm here to talk to you today about infrastructure down and dirty. Specifically, we're going to be getting into some best practices in Marketo. So some background a little bit on me before we get into all the specifics. So I am from a company called Etumos. We do Marketo consulting. And specifically how that's valuable in this is that we've been in and configured an enormous amount of Marketo instances. Enterprise, startups, in between, SMB, absolutely everything. And what I found over the years, is that we're doing the same things over and over. We're using the same building blocks, we're having a certain language that we use to talk about things, we're kind of inventing terms as we go, and really importantly, this isn't really well established in the B2B marketing realm. And so I think it's now a good, important time for marketing operations to get more specific and have an embedded philosophy on how to do this building and how to have a common core language between talking about all these things. So today I'm going to be throwing open the hood. I'm going to be showing you how we internally at Etumos talk about these very complex architectural things and some of the best practices that we've learned along the way, basically how to make really bulletproof different components of Marketo, how they connect to each other in a super scalable way. So to begin with, the overview, there's your overview. I want to talk about some major pieces here. First of all is our guiding philosophy, our guiding mantra, our building architecture mantra, and that is SCRAM, S-C-R-I-M. I'll be getting deep into that in a minute. Then we're going to go into some of the core concepts. These are things about how we talk about things philosophically. What is this program? How do we describe it on a high level in a way that really communicates something very quickly, as well as a building philosophy so that we can spend a sentence talking about something and both share that knowledge, transfer that knowledge from one person to another super quickly without having to troll through every single smart campaign and every single flow step in order to get there. And then we're going to go into some building block vernacular. These are nouns and names that we've come up with that are more an abstractions of the kind of core components of Marketo, so that we can use these in architectural speak, so that I can say, for example, to one of our consultants, one of our architects, I can say, all right, what we need to do is we need to modify our privacy compliance operational program. And right now it's just a program, it's an operational module. And currently right now we're building for CASL, GDPR, and CAN spam and embargoed. And that's our tree, and that's our actual master router campaign is doing that, and we need to add an additional step for India in order to have double opt-in compliance. And so that's going to be, so we can say very quickly, I can say to an architect, hey, modify the actual router and add in a step, add in a whole step, probably a controller step, to treat India specifically in order to accomplish double opt-in in order to do that. And that's the kind of level that we're trying to get to, where we can very rapidly have some ideation, communicate that to an architect understands and can then build from that, and can also know how that works. So this is going to be vital for large instances if you're doing lots of stuff with lots of different team members, where you have basically, you need a team of multiple architects in order for this to be super valuable for you. And also what we're trying to do, and specifically my goal with this, is I'm trying to come up with, and we're trying to push forward an overall approach and view of marketing operations in Marketo and best practices and guiding philosophies for these. And I want, I really think that these are things that we've learned over the course of 5 years, 6 years, doing this every single day, doing super advanced things all the time. And so I want to be able to share that knowledge so people don't have to struggle through the monotony in order to get there themselves. And kind of what I'm trying to do here is we'll have a lot of demos all throughout the talk. So here I just showed you a little bit. We have built some links and an actual page in order to profile all of these different things. So don't worry about having to take exhaustive notes in all of this, because we have, one, recorded the video, and two, we also have an entire resource of footnotes that you can go to. So you can see that link there right now. It's on the screen, etumos.com/nerdout. And if you're feeling joyful and generous, you can put in an optional UTM campaign there too. So this is again something that I had mentioned before. We have been doing architecting for a long time, and what I've found over doing this is that there's not a communal language to talk about the more advanced structures of things, versus there is in development. There is in web development. There are guiding philosophies in web development. There are guiding practices. There are trends that happen, and you can subscribe to a certain trend, and it might be better than another trend, and you can see the trends change over time, but there needs to be a guiding philosophy for this. It's kind of unified that people can follow, and if you start from nothing, you can latch onto a best practice, maybe inform your own opinions, and come up with something better and improve this over time. So we're trying to translate expertise very quickly, and this should become the trade speak for how to talk about marketing and Marketo architecting. What we do a lot is trying to just bottle best practices. As I say, if you just started, you should start with this framework, you should start with this architecting, and even if you don't understand every single component of it, if you don't understand why we do something a certain way, it'll become clear the more that you do it. Because really what we do is we don't do any of these things by accident. We have manually fine-tuned this overall architecture into a real science. It's a real engineering science that we've come up with this, and you'll see if you just follow this, you'll thank yourself later when you have to modify things in the future. And it's really a key to scaling MarTech and marketing operations is to use this unified language, this consistent building philosophy, and to bring it all together. So for example, if you're an enterprise company, or you're a mega agency, a mega consulting company, what you need is a key to scale. You need a same consistent practice, and you need to be able to scale. You need to be able to bring in another architect, another senior Marketo person, and use the same language and start very quickly. And this is a key to being able to do that. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what has been our internal mantra for about a year now. This has been something that, it's taken a long time for us to get to this. It's an acronym, and this is our test. Every single time that we develop something, every single time that we build something, we ask ourselves, does it adhere to our SCRAM building philosophy? Now, what SCRAM stands for is scalable, clear, robust, intelligent, and modular. All of those 5 acronym components make up a program that's actually going to scale. And so everything that we do, every evaluation of all of our architectural programs, things like preference centers, things like privacy compliance, things like lifecycle processing, traffic director, everything else like this is evaluated and built and criticized based on its ability to be scalable, clear, robust, intelligent, and modular. So scalable, let's talk a little bit about this. This is, pretty intuitive probably. Scalable means that it should work with 10x the campaign volume. It should work with 100x the campaign volume. It should work with more campaigns. That's one evaluation. It needs to work with a larger database and larger throughput of records. That's another consideration. And it needs to scale with a team. And that means that really this needs to be a core foundation, is that it may start small, but it needs to not break when it gets big just by volume with nothing else changing. Clear. This is, I think, a key differentiator between, our approach and what you might see out there. So as you might be aware, there is a bit of an argument within the advanced Marketo usership about the benefits and the, I'd say, inherent quality goodness of using request campaigns. And basically what we've done over time, we use request campaign a lot. This is a really small, minute detail, but the idea is that anyone should be able to go into Marketo program, look at an operational program that we've built, and then read through the tree to understand exactly what happens in all of it. And so that's the idea of clear, is we want to make sure that if you scan the tree, which is the sidebar in Marketo, look at all the local assets, the names of the smart campaigns, the naming convention with those smart campaigns, a person should have a clear knowledge and understand what is happening, or rather what's supposed to happen with each of these things. Robust. Robust is really important, and it's one of those things that you only learn with experience after having been in many instances. That means that if we change a functionality, we want to make sure that it doesn't break. We're not looking at, just does it work with large volumes, that's scale. We're looking at robustness, which is its slow depreciation time, is really the kind of key return on investment that we're looking in robust as a category. We're making sure that it works now, and we're making sure that if we change another piece of the system, it's not going to destroy all of the rest of it. This is how you really, minimize the time that you spend on infrastructure, because you build programs and modules and operational programs and architecture that isn't going to be negatively impacting each other, and it will, actually scale in terms of increasing your overall architectural pieces. Intelligent is another piece. This is the I in Scrim. Intelligent is super important because this is kind of a key piece of if you're doing any kind of development, is you want to make sure that your functions, your actual programs, you want to make sure that you're aware of when they fail, how they fail, why they fail. And that's a key piece of how we build all these things in Marketo, and something that's usually overlooked in Marketo. We see a big problem is that a lot of programs, if you have somebody who's not invested as much time in the architecting originally, the operational, security basically, and the robustness of the program, you see what we call silent errors. That is to say that people are building for best case scenarios. They're building for how it works right now, not anticipating how it won't work and how it might fail. And then they have, it's a common problem. If you see something, how long does it take you to identify a key vulnerability, a key mistake in your system after it's been going? Sometimes it happens, 3 months, 6 months. If it's a data management piece that you report on quarterly, you probably won't notice until 3 months down the line. And a key piece of building any architecture and how we do this is to make sure to build for exception alerts. We make this program intelligent, so it will tell us when it's broken. And we can go in as soon as that happens in a real-time fashion and actually fix things so that it's not 3 months later when we have to report to the board and can't explain why we have data that's not trustable. And then the final piece is modular. Modular, we think of this is a core component of how we build things, is we try to look at every operational program as actually being able to have a individual kind of a Lego approach. We want to say the core spine is lifecycle processing, and every operational program is a module. It should solve one problem, and it should be the solution for one problem. What this means is that there should be a consistent in and an out, and that it's just focusing on that one thing. And basically that gives you the ability to very easily stack things on top of each other. So for example, if you're looking at lead scoring, we look at behavior scoring as different from demographic scoring. Those are two different modules. They interact in very similar ways. The output is basically very similar, especially if you're summing into lead score, but they're different modules. And if we ever want to, for example, turn off or modify behavior scoring, then we go into the behavior scoring program, change and tweak the token variable values, and then we can have a different behavior score without it negatively interacting with and affecting demographic score. So for example, a bad setup in you're doing a sum to lead score is that if you have double steps where you're saying anytime behavior score changes, we also want to change demographic score, and we want to sum up linearly into a net lead score. And that is an example of something, it seems like a good idea at the time, and it will come back and bite you when you need to modify anything at all. And a better approach is to say, Lead score is its own module. It comes out with its own number value. Behavior score is its own module, comes out with its own value. And then we sum them up dynamically as opposed to recreating each step every time. And that way you can actually scale. You know, it's dynamic. It's not solving the other person's problem. We're not solving behavior score problems and demographic score. We're building it all together so that the net result is going to be, you know, really be able to grow in itself. And this is a key component, as I say. So SCRM is our overall building philosophy. And, you know, I think this is a key piece, and we like to evaluate all of our programs based on these criteria. Giving it a number score and saying it gives you a voice for criticism that isn't just, I don't like this because it should be done better. You say, I don't like this because I'm worried that it's not robust, or I don't like this because it's not clear, or I don't like this because I'm worried about silent failures. I'm worried about if we do this, what goes wrong if it breaks? How could it break? And are we thinking through that? And will we make sure that we can address those as they happen? So lifecycle processing is one of the core pieces that we talk about. We consider it to be the core spine of Marketo. This is where all data is managed, all order of operations is managed. We have one lead is created trigger in the entire system. And this happens in lifecycle processing. It's the original thing that happens. We have an original processing section, and then we have lifecycle milestone specific triggers as well as flows. So you can see on this diagram here, this is kind of a high level of what this looks like. We have an original lead is created right up here. We have this overall processing. This is a program, which is a consolidation of many other smart campaigns. We like to think of these as being hooked out. So a good example is add to nurture. One of the things that we do, you know, if somebody becomes a marketing accepted lead, that means they didn't get further down the line. They're not MQL, they're not a sales lead, they're not a customer. When somebody becomes a marketing accepted lead, we want a central consolidated way to do things to that person. We want to stamp that they're a marketing accepted lead. We want to timestamp, and then we want to do things like add to nurture. Add to nurture is a module in itself because we request another program that we call a traffic director, and this traffic director determines the best fit engagement program for that person. And it's really important to do this in this kind of approach because really this is turning your revenue waterfall into an actual operational program so that we can say the point of every stage is to move further down the funnel. And in order to move down the funnel, we need to have a consolidated strategy. We need to say the whole goal of MAL, marketing accepted lead, is to get to MQL, marketing qualified lead. And how do we do that? We need to nurture them. They need to have behavior score and demographic score, and they need to be behind a threshold. How do we get that threshold? We need to send them relevant content. And then we say, what's our hypothesis for the best fit? Maybe that's going to be based on persona. Maybe it's going to be based on product interest. Maybe it's based on use case. Any of those are all hypotheses, but it should be controlled by one consolidated area, and that is in lifecycle processing. So lifecycle processing is the core spine. Every other, and we like to think of it also as a spine. So you can imagine there's an up and down of the spine, and each piece, each individual bone there should be a hook into another operational program, another module. And that way, it's really easy to remove modules, and it's really easy to add modules, because this means that all we have to do is, within lifecycle processing, request one or remove that request. So I'm going to take a quick look into lifecycle processing in our system itself. So as I say, lifecycle processing is what we consider to be the core spine of Marketo. And so everything starts with this lead is created. This is the key that kicks everything off. You can see all these green request arrows means that each of these is requested by a smart campaign. And that is to say a request campaign. So this lead is created. This is a combination of a lot of things that we're going to talk about in a second, but basically this is a controller smart campaign, requests everything else, and then finally what happens, as you saw in the PowerPoint, after we do all this data management to somebody who, regardless of stage, we need to do things like sync to Salesforce. We need to verify an email address with a third-party solution. We need to run demographic gating, and we need to set their subscription status if we have a preference center to make sure that they're opted into the right categories. And so this controller program in lifecycle processing does all these things, of which the final thing that it does is sort into the best fit lifecycle status. And that's what we're doing right here. So you can see basically what we're trying to do is at the end of this, first we want to do these things that are happening to absolutely every record, regardless of if they're a customer or brand new into the system. And then the final thing that we do with them after and within original processing is we sort them into the best fit. And so in order to do that, we have request campaigns, and it's just like the diagram that you just saw. We're looking for its cascading logic. We're looking for the best fit, the lowest part in the funnel. That's where we're going to place these people. So let's jump back into the life cycle and the PowerPoint slide here. So this is the diagram of what's happening, and you can kind of see it reflected within Marketo itself in that program. So lifecycle processing is a key piece because it's kind of everything that runs, and it encapsulates a lot of our overall building philosophy. I want to talk a little bit about some specific approaches that even you can very quickly, just by understanding this, you can say, yes, we have lead source built decentralized, or we have lead source built centralized, or we have whatever program, and we can talk about those in a way that makes sense. So two adjectives here: decentralized versus centralized. Decentralized means that it's happening in many programs, templatized, on a templatized basis. A really common example of this is interesting moments. Very common, you say in each program template, in each program, every marketing program, if they perform an interesting action, it's very common for somebody to put in a flow step and say, interesting moment happened. This person registered for this webinar. Or interesting moment happened. This person booked a meeting at your event. And that would be an example of a decentralized approach to interesting moments. The opposite view is, and the opposite building approach would be a centralized program. Now, a centralized program is one Marketo operational program, generally, and this is where things are happening in a one consolidated area. This means that it's happening generally asynchronously. An example is lead source. Our lead source is built, and we generally recommend that lead source is built centralized. It's harder to do. It takes more mental thought process to get there, but it's the key to being scalable and robust. So specifically, robustness as a criteria for this. If you have a lead source program where you're manually setting lead source in every marketing program, every marketing campaign, either manually or through a combination of flow steps with tokens, if you ever need to change that approach, you now have to modify every single program that's ever been built. And that is what we consider not scalable and not robust, because when you try to change something, it all fell apart and now you have to rebuild it all from scratch. So generally, I consider centralized to be quite superior to a decentralized approach. Whenever possible, I prefer to build things, and we prefer to build things in a centralized fashion. So centralized, it's consolidated operations. Really good examples are lead scoring. We want to have lead scoring in a single program. We want to have behavior scoring as its own program. We want to have demographic scoring as its own program, and we want to have lead sourcing as its own program. Those are some key examples. And then the other example, and you still can't get away from some decentralized things. Really, it's a matter of what's the most scalable in terms of every single time that you do something, what is the way that you can minimize the amount of effort in order required to do that thing? Interesting moments is generally a pretty good example of this. If you have content-specific, marketing program-specific interesting moments, then you kind of have to do a decentralized approach with this. And another example is most recent campaign. So basically, you're trying to play with tokens. Tokens is the way that you actually scale this. You have lead tokens, you have program tokens, you have system tokens, and you have trigger tokens. And so each of those, you're trying to figure out, what's the way, if we can build it centralized, we prefer that. If we can't build it decentralized, if we rely on something that happens just on the program level, then that would be, for example, if you want to say, if there's every program in your program template has a campaign name token, program token, my dot token. In the flow step of the autoresponder, what you could do if you wanted to say, what is my most recent campaign? Every single time you would be changing the lead field value of most recent campaign to double squiggles, my dot program name, campaign name. And that would be a decentralized way to do it. You're still trying to save yourself as much time as possible because it's based on program tokens and it's totally templatized. But that's kind of the best that you can do because there's not really a good way to do that from another program outside of its centralized. So modular, when we're talking about operational programs, we're trying to make them act independently and latch in on top of each other. You can kind of imagine this like Legos. We're trying to build individual Legos. Each one is its own little piece, but you can add them together, you can stack them together, and you can create more things on top of that. So that's kind of our building approach, and you can see it specifically within lifecycle processing. I'm going to jump again into a demo real quick. But lifecycle processing is a great prime example of how this all runs. As I mentioned, lifecycle processing is the core spine of how the rest of Marketo works. And one of the key things that we do, I'll give you an example with a backup Salesforce sync. So a Salesforce sync is to say we want a backup case. In case ideally somebody should be synced by a program to a campaign sync, it's best for API calls for Salesforce. But we also want to make sure that if they haven't been synced by a program, that we still send that person over the line. We want to make sure that within 30 minutes, a salesperson gets alerted that there's a new sale and they can act on that person. There's a new prospect, they can act on that person quickly. And so here's an example. Within lifecycle processing, our original processing here, basically the third step after a record is created, we request this backup Salesforce sync program. This is a different module. And the value of this is that we have another program in here. It's its own modular thing. It's quite simple. And we're looking at this. Just a second. Fixing errors in our instance.
Sorry, this part will be on a screen record anyways.
Okay. So a good example of this in modular approaches is a Salesforce sync. As the third step here after a record is created, we want to make sure that they're synced to Salesforce in a timely manner. And so how we do that is we have lifecycle processing have a flow step, which is to request the backup Salesforce sync campaign. And so how we do that, we have this program, it requests another campaign, and this is the hook into our other module, which is a backup Salesforce sync program. It requests this once, this is the beginning of everything, and then we say, great. Generally, philosophically, what we're looking at is after 15 minutes, if this person is not already synced to Salesforce, we want to sync that person to Salesforce manually using an API call. It's more timely, but it costs more API calls, so it's not very scalable if you were only to do API calls. So this is the great balance in between. It's robust in that we're not... It's rather robust and intelligent because we're not waiting on someone to not be synced over to Salesforce. That's a good example of a silent error that happens all the time. And it's really pretty difficult to find that unless you intelligently build your programs to watch for it. And so that's exactly what we do is after 15 minutes, a person should have been synced by a program to a campaign sync. If they haven't been synced, then we want to say, okay, we've given it enough time. Now we just care about timeliness. It's not going to be as scalable. It's going to take more API calls, but we're going to do it anyway because it's worth it. And that's how we can actually get down to the individual one, which is we're going to sync this record using auto assignment rules, and we're going to manually sync that person. So that's kind of an example of what we're looking at here, and kind of a core building philosophy and how modules fit in with other modules. So as you know, as we mentioned, it's kind of a Lego approach where we can stack modules on top of each other. Okay, now we're getting into the final piece of this core building philosophy, which is operational program architecture. This is to say, we've done a lot of things over the years in terms of working with operational programs. And what I've found is that there are consistently very similar requests from one solution to the next solution in terms of, if we're talking about lead enrichment, should we do lead enrichment? Who gets enriched? How do we enrich? By which criteria? How do we make sure that this person happened at the time, and that we have the smart list built in a way that we can determine what happens in the future also. And there are a few major components of what we consider kind of the archetype of an operational program and how we build it. And what we do is we have triggers as their own folder. This is a key piece, because any operational module that we build, we want to know exactly how people get into the flow. And there are basically three ways that we consider that. One is once. That's usually to say that a person can only flow through once, and it's usually requested by Lifecycle Processing. And this is how they kick off the rest of the flow. The second way that people get in is if something is triggered. Good example for that is fills out form on a centralized lead source program. If you fill out a form, we want to go through your stamping. We want to make sure you have a last stamp and a concatenated stamp and everything else together. And the way that that all gets kicked off is by a trigger. And it happens more than once per life cycle. And the other final thing that we have here is kind of a batch. This is mostly for retrospective. It kind of does something like reset your previous value and then do it all again. It's also really vital for retrospective updates, which is a common thing. So frequently these modules are built to be forward facing, and then you have to go through slightly different, slightly tweaked logic in order to batch people through retrospectively. A reroll is pretty important because it resets the previous answer and then it computes again. This is the most common in what we consider demographic gating. Let me pull it up in our instance and I can actually show you what it looks like. So there is quite commonly comes with Marketo a demographic scoring program. If you're familiar with it, you can see generally how it works. So jumping into demographic gating, there's some things that I want to talk about here. This is a great example of what a reroll looks like and how the actual triggers interact with things. So demographic scoring. Out of the box, people probably know demographic scoring, there's one that comes out of the box in Marketo. And it's based on if people have things. If somebody has a title, if a job title changes, then we're going to increment by a certain amount of score. And the problem is that it's not robust or scalable. The problem with that out-of-the-box solution that they have there in that program that comes into most instances is that what happens if somebody gets promoted? What happens if you have somebody with a bad value before? They were scored as a marketing manager. You gave them 5 points for demographic score. And then you find through data enrichment that that wasn't correct before. And so instead, we're going to change that to a manager of communications. Now that is the same title, but the out-of-the-box solution is going to increment again by 5 points. And that's a problem. So really what we need to do in thinking through this, whiteboarding through this, we want to say, okay, what are the criteria for scoring these people? The first needs to be when they're created. We want to go through, roll through all of their information, give them a net score for demographic score. And then the second thing that needs to happen is we want to say, if we have updated information, and this isn't the first time, if we have updated information, such as through progressive profiling or enrichment, we can actually go in and we have this gating reroll. As opposed to doubling up on scores, as opposed to having a huge rat's nest, that's very difficult to figure out where people have come in, what has changed. We have this one gating reroll smart campaign. It's triggered based on any of these important values changing. And the first thing that it does is it actually waits, and then we're going to reset the score to 0. It's a reroll. And so that means we want to say, we've got all the information. Let's throw out the old result. Let's do it again. Let's figure out what the answer is now. And this is to say it's kind of a really scalable approach in being able to do this, because if you ever have changes, if you add steps in here, if you ever want to get somebody through this or redo all of your demographic scoring, all you have to do is a batch rescore. Because all of this logic all runs correctly, you make sure that first we're setting demographic score to 0, and then we're requesting this daisy chain set of smart campaigns that will add up values. So it makes it really easy to actually do this. And the key is, for looking at this in the sidebar, we say this is really clear. It's really clear what's happening. We have numbers set up for the folders to determine the major stages. 0 triggers, which is to say it just happens here. These are pass-through, as we consider them. Pass-through smart campaigns. All they do is they're triggered and then they request another smart campaign. We have the second set of criteria, which is number 1 scoring. And then this is all the smart campaigns. They're all daisy chained together so that we add up a net score every time. And then we say, okay, the last one, it seems like pretty obviously after we go through scoring, we have gating. And gating is our own kind of invention, but it is to say that, people don't really care about what somebody's abstract demographic score is. They care if they're demographically qualified. And so that's usually set by a threshold. We want to say, let's convert this number into an actual Boolean of qualified, not qualified, and then act on that. And so this is what it does. We say, great, after we're done with all this stage, we get into gating stage, and then we figure out either people go into pass, enrich, or fail, or always, because it's intelligent, an error which nobody should ever get into. And then the final is to assign a task to the XDR, which is to say your SDR, your BDR, any way that you want to consider that. But that's a really good example of how these triggers work really well with each other. Okay, so we're talking about cross-system indicators, or a CSI. It's purposefully, cleverly related to the television show. The idea is that we have an operational field that we want to communicate across systems with. This is a key piece of the architecture, is making sure you control order of operations. There are so many problems by not controlling order of operations intelligently. It's usually a key piece of where we see everything else failing. It's just somebody not thinking through, or thinking in best case scenario, we had a 15-minute wait step, it's going to be all fine and dandy. And it'll be true for 90% of the volume. It'll be true for 90% of the cases. But in 10% of the cases, it's going to break. And in that case, you're going to have no idea why. It's going to take digging, it's going to take refixing things, it's going to take adjusting times, adjusting triggers, everything else like that. And so one of the key components that we've figured out over time in order to control this across systems, Marketo runs Lifecycle Processing, usually has to interact with Salesforce. Salesforce has its own enrichment tools. Salesforce brings in product information if you have an integration from your product into Salesforce. And the way that we control the order of operations against these systems is a CSI processing field, a cross-system indicator processing field. And there are kind of two that we really look at. You can combine them into one if you'd like. But we have 2 fields on the lead and the contact. We have a CSI processing status, which should have a numerical value, and that should show the relative step, one to the next, and it should have room in between. And then the processing description is more the human description of how things work. The idea is that status is what we're going to be using in the system itself. We're going to say, if CSI processing status changes to 200, that means that that'll be your trigger on the Salesforce side to say, now we can run this Apex workflow and we can enrich this person. And the final step of that, after it goes through on the Salesforce side, all of the enriching, it'll modify, the last step will be to modify the CSI processing status to 300, which is to pass it back to Marketo. And Marketo is triggered off of that CSI processing status changing to that new value. And that's how you have order of operations. You make sure that things are entirely purposefully synchronous, as opposed to asynchronous, which is where they're happening in tandem, and it's kind of a confusion of wait steps. And ideally, how the way that your system works is you minimize wait steps as much as possible. You should never have an arbitrary time of a wait step, because you run into processing issues, you have a campaign queue, you have a Salesforce sync delay, you have any other random amount of variables, and it's going to work certainly 90% of the time, but that 10% is what's going to break. And that 10%, this is the benefit of working in operations, is you mostly get blamed for the failures and not praised for anything working as it should. So you're trying to minimize that risk, and you're trying to minimize the errors that happen. And CSIs are a vital way to do that cross technologies, cross MarTech platforms. So now we're getting into the real vernacular. These are the things, these are the nouns, the verbs that you should take away and start using immediately. And really what you're going to find out is that a lot of you say, I've already built that. You know, you didn't reinvent the wheel. I already have come up with that. And that's because this is kind of the commonsensical final result of a lot of architecting, is it comes out to these types of foundational building blocks and how that kind of vernacular grows. And we're just trying to put a name onto it. People have come up with it, people have done this before, but we want to consolidate that so that when I say router campaigns, you hear cascading logic, tree logic. And so let's get into router campaigns. This is the first one. This is also one of the most common pieces that we use. So a router campaign is the name that we use to encompass a smart campaign, the master campaign, as that does a single flow step, which is a request campaign based on choices, based on cascading logic and best fit within that. So router campaigns, basically what they're trying to do is you're taking a central flow of records, and then you're trying to say, based on some other criteria, we should take that single flow and put it into different options. And that's based on a single criteria. So if you can imagine that you have 100% of records right through here and they're going down this route, we want to make sure that based on a certain criteria, maybe they fit into here. We get 10% into section A and choice A, versus we get 50% into choice B. And then, you know, we get the remainder 40% into choice C. And this is a key way that we can have a central processing, and then we can put everyone through the top here, and we can sort them into and kind of build a Plinko machine of making sure that people fall into the category that we want without having to build 3 separate campaigns with logic that we try to make exclusive and comprehensive, but is actually pretty difficult to do. And this is kind of a core component of what we do. So we have a master, we call it a master smart campaign. And this is the one where that's the 100%. This is the master. And what this does, this master, is this goes through all of these based on request campaign here. Request campaign, and then this contains all of the individual sections and the individual smart campaigns that go into these other options. So we have the master router, and then we have the individual steps that are the next stage. So you can see here that there's some nuances to this and kind of best practices that you think are unnecessary, but you'll learn that they're not unnecessary and they are actually quite vital. And so I'm going to get into the actual instance. We're going to walk through an email verification. And this is a master router. I'm trying to start very simple here. We're starting with a master router. It's requested. It's requested from the triggers because we want to make sure that there's one trigger consolidated area and that we have it bottlenecked. That is the bottleneck that determines how many people go through the next stages. This master campaign, we check based on if people are in 2 different things. This is cascading logic, so that means it's similar to segmentations. It's the best fit somebody's going to fit into, they're going to fall into. So the first choice that they qualify for, they'll be into that. So if there is, if somebody is in choice 1 and 2, they will only go through choice 1. And here's some nitty-gritty details that you probably don't think are important, but they will become later. The first one is you want to do, as opposed to, you might say, well, wait, Edward, why don't I just do a change data value? That's all that I'm going to do with this. The final step is I'm just going to change a data value. Why don't I instead have a change data value with 3 steps? And the answer is it's not robust. It's not robust because that may be all you want to do right now, but it's probably not all you're going to do in the future. And if you want to change that to have 2 steps in the future, then that means that you have to rebuild that and duplicate it. And that's not a good use of time. So instead what we do is we have a request campaign. And what this does is it allows us to have multiple flow steps based on the same tree logic right up here, without duplicating, without doubling our work later on down the line. So it's based on if somebody is a member of a smart list. And so you might say, again, okay, Edward, I don't really need that much complexity. What if I just said, instead of member of smart list, which is an abstraction smart list, and maybe adds extra steps and maybe seems like it might be less clear, what if instead I say, if somebody's Salesforce type is empty, then I want to sync them, and if it's not empty, I don't want to sync them. We say, great, that's fine, but again, not robust. That may be what you start with. That's probably not what you're going to finish with. Even if you are very confident, every single time, it's easier to start from this archetypal version that's based on smart list criteria as opposed to manually building things in, because it's just going to save you time. And especially to have everything in the same structure, it makes it easier to read. It makes it clearer for new people who are coming in and inheriting your instance. So in this case, we have a master router. We have 100% of the records going through here. And then we go through a filter for 11A, which is to check validation. This is to say, we want to make sure that we're going to do an individual webhook to enrich their email address, make sure they're valid or not. And there's kind of the group that is valid, and then there's a group that we don't care about. We're confident about them. We don't want to waste an API call. We don't want to pay the 2 cents to do it. En masse, you can really have some cost savings by this kind of approach. And it's an overall smart list. And this kind of approach, we have individual to smart list criteria. We have all of this right here. You can see it's quite complex, and we can use all of that. And then the other case is people who we don't want to check validation for, is anyone who's anonymous. And it should be everyone else. So the idea is that people should fall into step A or B, or the other steps, and never into the error step. In the case that somebody falls into the error, it's an email exception alert. It actually sends through an email address that we set up. It's based on the alias, and we add them to a static list. And this is a kind of key component of how to do that. All right, rolling straight along. So the second major type that we have is a controller campaign. A controller campaign is asynchronous. That means that we don't care about the order in which things happen. We just want them to happen. So you say, what's the difference between asynchronous versus synchronous in terms of how much do I care? And the answer is that it really depends on the situation. We use asynchronous when things are not process dependent, they're not system dependent, as well as when things aren't necessarily timely. If it doesn't matter, for example, when you're going to stamp them as a marketing accepted lead, that could be an example of something that you can say, I don't really care about the timing. I'm just going to go with the easy, more robust setup, and it's also more clear. So that's really a difference between controller campaigns versus down here, daisy chains. Daisy chain is the other alternative method. And a daisy chain has one campaign, it does something, and then the next flow step is it requests the next step, the next actual smart campaign. The problem with that, the benefit is it's synchronous. You make sure that the next thing doesn't happen until the last thing ends. And that's a great benefit. It's a great benefit, but the problem is that it's not super robust. It's really monotonous. If you, for example, need to modify on demographic scoring, we have a step 150, which is individual job role. If you say that's no longer valuable, I don't like it, I want to remove it, that means that you have to modify, not just delete that individual one, but modify 140 to request instead 160. You need to rename the order of all these things, and you need to go through that process. And it's quite not just monotonous, but a strong use of time. It's a good use. It takes up quite a bit of time to do. Switches are another way that we talk about optional flows or optional smart campaigns. This is really common in the case of preference centers. If you have somebody they come into a lead source, and you determine, if somebody filled out a newsletter form, you want to treat them and subscribe them to certain topics, such as your blog, such as your newsletter, such as your events, such as your marketing, overall nurture. But sometimes you want to say, I want 100% of our records to flow through this, but I don't want necessarily all of them. But there's so much advanced logic going on here that they don't just fit into a simple tree like this, certainly it's actually a combination. They could be, on-off switches is what we're trying to do. It's kind of a Boolean, and either it happens or it doesn't. And how we do that is based on an individual flow step, such as request campaign. You can see on the screen here, where we say, if you're a member of this basically green light smart list, then you should do something. Otherwise, you don't do anything at all. And that's what we consider a switch. It's an optional flow. It's an optional smart campaign. Many people use this, but this is how we talk about things really quickly. We can say, add a new switch to the preference center, add a new switch for webinars specifically, not just events, but add a new switch. And that person can hear that and say, great, switch, optional logic, based on smart list membership. If they're in this list, then we're going to do these things. And that's a clear way to communicate and keep things going. So here's a little diagram example. Smart lists, you can see they either go into the switch version or they keep going. So some people go into the switch and some people go straight to the smart list. Daisy chains, as I mentioned, they're synchronous, which is really valuable, but they're really hard to maintain. So I give them, really high because synchronicity is very important in controlling race conditions. But when race conditions don't matter, then I'd rather go with this step of having a controller that requests all these smart campaigns all at once, lets them go in their own time, and then goes to the final step. But the idea with demographic gating here is first we need to score people. And then once we're confident that all the scoring is done, then we need to evaluate based on the results of that. So that's related. That's dependent upon another system. And that's why this needs to be synchronous in demographic gating as an example. And so we have, these synchronous flows and all the campaigns request each other. That's a key piece of it. And so generally when we're going in here, I want to wrap up a little bit here and say, there's an overall philosophy that we've developed over time. It seems like it might not be as valuable on face, but it's something that you learn over time is incredibly valuable. And there's a lot of nuance to how we did a bunch of these pieces. We have a framework that ties it all together, but you need an overall building philosophy. You need consistent naming conventions that you can use to clearly see things. You need the order of operations to work, and you need a framework to tie it all together. So before we go, I just want to do one last thing of walking through a single program end to end here. And so I'm going to walk through this email validation. It's email verification here. It's quite simple. We have a trigger here. It's a trigger campaign. It's requested. We know it's requested from Lifecycle Processing. And then we go into this master router. And from this master router, we have 100% of people going through master router. And then we're trying to get a portion into step A and a portion into step B. And then we also want to make sure that we're intelligent by saying if they don't qualify for A or B, which it should never happen, that we get alerted immediately because something's wrong. We didn't build for this case. It's an exception, and I want to know about it immediately, not 3 months down the line when I have questions from the board or the advisors about, where are these reports and why does this data look like junk? So to go into here, 11A here, it's 110A. So it's requested, as all of these are. And then what we do is we have 2 steps. That's also a big thing that we've noticed and is really helpful for doing this over time and improving on the architecture as we've built it. First, even if you want to do something very simple, you should do that one simple thing. The example here is a webhook. We call an actual verification webhook to ping that email address, see if it's a real email address, make sure it's not personal email address, make sure it's not a spam trap, everything else, we get the results of that. The second thing that we want to do is just for the Marketo admins and the architects, and that is to add them to a static list. As people probably know, there are kind of 2 different ways that you can have lists happen. You can have a static list, and then you can have a smart list. And similarly, you'd say, if we were to go into this and we see that people are in errors or we don't understand why people are falling into what, in the case of order of operations, you run into a really tricky thing where you might be microseconds apart. And if you evaluate before a data value is in there and it comes in seconds after, they may go to another smart campaign. If we're dependent on some system value that comes in 30 seconds after this, we could see this person go and qualify, and rightfully, if we pull this smart list, we'd say, this person should have qualified here. What happened? How could this person not? There might be a problem with our structure. And really the answer, and that's why we have these static lists, is smart lists are true for right now. But they're not a snapshot in time. They're just saying right now, this person fits into this criteria. But really what you care about is where did somebody fit at the time that they were evaluated? And that's the value of a static list, is you can see where they were then. And also you can see if they're there now, but are now in a different group, then we have an order of operations problem. Or we have some other things going on, such as, people screwing with the same data, people transitioning. Maybe we need to do a re-roll instead because somebody qualifies now, didn't then, and we still expect that they should. Therefore, we should do a triggered re-roll based on that value changing, as an example. Smart lists here, and to jump a little bit into the details here. So how we try to build these smart lists and the logic for these cascading logic is we try to build 100% of the pie. But we don't do that by starting with the whole pie. We're trying to build out piece by piece and make it entirely comprehensive. So what that means is you want to think of every single exception case, every single treatment that could possibly happen, and put people into that. And you have smart lists in order to do that. So we want to say, for example, that they haven't gone through verification. That's who we know is valid to be checking validation on that email address. And we want to make sure that they have an email address so it's even interesting, the result at all. And that's important. That's building out the positive aspect here. The second one that we want to do is not to check validations. We want to say, okay, if somebody shouldn't check validation, it should probably be something like the inverse of those rules. But it'd be really easy and a cheap way to do it to say, everyone else. There are two options, everyone else gets in there. And the problem with that is you get a lot of silent errors that way. You don't plan for a certain exception case, and then you run into a problem of people are falling into the default category, which does terrible things on accident. For example, we ran into a situation a long time ago where, based on email enrichment, very similar to this, we found a situation where it was architected to say that if the response was empty from a certain validation tool, enrichment tool, that we should marketing suspend. And what happens from that is that was not built to be intelligent. That was not built to be robust and think of all possible situations. And really the negative impact from that is that when their subscription tool was outdated, their payment expired, that webhook started spitting off, you don't have any money. And that wasn't a case that was built in to the actual logic. And so instead, that was the everyone else bucket. And what happened is that they were accidentally marketing suspending and unsubscribing huge amounts of actual people. It was something like 75% of their actual database was being marketing suspended. And there was no intelligent alert about it. And so we didn't figure out that this happened until 3 months later when somebody said, this brand new list of 1,000 people, it says that 999 are marketing suspended. And we say, okay, great, there's a problem. And we also found out that it's been a problem for a long time. So this is kind of a key piece of building it. And then the exception error here is where we say nobody should ever fall into this category. And if they do fall into this category, we're going to look into it. And we can also gauge based on this exception alert. We have an automated and tokenized exception alert with the information. And we can look at this and see the groupings and say, are we getting 1,000 emails a day about this problem, or are we 10 minutes? Or rather, are we 1,000 problems with this, 1,000 emails with this problem, or are we a total of 10 over the last 3 months? And that kind of guides your priority of where you spend your time fixing problems. So to wrap it all up here, to go back to our final stage here, I think it's really important, and I would certainly encourage people to start using the SCRM methodology. So look at your setup, look at your overall infrastructure, and start looking piece by piece. does this adhere to a Scrum building methodology, which is to say, is it scalable? Is it clear to a human who's reading it? Is it robust and won't break if we add or modify some small thing? Is it intelligent so that we know when it breaks, how it breaks immediately? And is it modular so that it can easily be added, removed, or improved upon? With an overall framework, you can see a lot of it here. This is kind of the deep framework. I'd also recommend going to this page on the screen, etumos.com/nerdout. If you're being generous, add in that UTM campaign there, so we can watch you in the analytics and see your actual experience going. But make sure you have naming convention consistency. That's on that link right there. We provided naming conventions, and look through our previous videos because we didn't go deep into a lot of these programs, but we have at previous Marketo summits, and we have a lot of documentation on how to do this superbly well. So you should go to that site, click through it, and see how it all works together. All right, well, that's all we have time for. I appreciate your taking the time to listen to me spiel on about this, and appreciate any feedback. Shoot me a message or chat us up however you can on our site and browse through other assets. So also, it's important to note that you should click on this. This is your key piece of moving forward in the MarTech process to excellence.